What if I told you that a simple forgotten object completely changed the course of an investigation that seemed resolved? Today, I will tell you about the most shocking case I have faced as a forensic doctor, where the key was not in what was obvious, but in something that no one had seen. It all started with an apparently simple scene. An adult man found in his home with no clear signs of violence or immediate causes of death. While everything seemed to point to a natural passing, something in my instinct made me focus on a detail that everyone else overlooked. That small out-of-place object revealed an error in the initial story and opened a new line of investigation that completely changed the truth behind that case. I am Dr. Esteban Landa, a forensic doctor with more than 2 decades of experience in Mexico City, and this is a story that taught me that in forensic science, patience and attention to detail are the difference between an accurate report and one that hides the truth. Before we begin, let me know in the comments from where you are watching this video, so I can see how far this story has reached. It was an ordinary night when we received the call. A man, approximately 45 years old, had been found dead in his downtown apartment. The family reported no prior incidents or known medical problems. At first glance, the scene appeared orderly, with no signs of violence or third-party involvement, which seemed to point to a natural death or a domestic accident. However, something made me doubt from the very first moments. The body, already stiff but with no visible injuries, was seated in a chair with a book beside him and a cup with coffee remnants on the table. The room was intact. No signs of struggle or disorder indicating a fight or attempt to flee. The initial police report mentioned sudden death, but I needed to be sure, to check every detail to rule out any hidden possibility. While examining the scene, I noticed a small object on the floor, almost hidden under a rug. It was something ordinary, insignificant at first glance, but out of place in that context. I approached and picked up a pen, but not an ordinary one. It had a name and a logo of a private clinic engraved on it, a clue that initially didn't seem relevant, but reminded me of a phone conversation mentioned in preliminary report. Investigating that object, I discovered that the deceased had visited that clinic days before his death. This raised questions the family hadn't mentioned. What treatment was he receiving? Are there medical records that might clarify the reasons? From there, the autopsy revealed something unexpected, and the whole scenario changed. What seemed like a closed and routine case became a deep investigation that reminded me of the importance of looking beyond what is obvious. The smallest details in an object that no one had seen literally made all the difference. I invite you to stay until the end of this video to find out how a small object that almost went unnoticed led me to uncover a truth no one expected. I had entered the apartment early that morning, with the light timidly filtering to the living room window, because there was nothing to indicate urgency. The man, Javier, about 45 years old, lay in his armchair, just as someone might fall asleep in front of a movie, with no external signs of violence or disturbance. I looked at his face calmly, searching for any clue, something that could explain that definitive silence, that absence of life that sometimes shows up without making a sound. The scene seemed too simple. Even the place looked untouched, with no apparent signs of struggle or haste. But something didn't fit. That feeling lingered like a shadow. My eyes immediately scanned the room carefully. After making sure the body had no visible wounds, I proceeded to document the scene with care, every angle, every object, because forensic work is sometimes more about patience than quick moves or big discoveries. It was then that something tiny, almost imperceptible, strongly caught my attention. An object out of place that almost no one would have noticed because it was camouflaged among a pile of papers and everyday items. It was a pen, a simple one, with a very worn blue cap. The curious thing was not that, but its position. It was placed upside down on top of an open book, but at random, as if it had been left hurriedly or as if someone wanted to leave a wordless message. I approached cautiously, holding my breath involuntarily, because at that moment I understood that that simple pen could be the key. There were no signs of force, no weapons, no traces of blood, but the object seemed to scream a story different from the version given to the first responders. The first official hypothesis was that it was a natural stop, a heart attack, a sudden collapse. But then, why had that small detail been left as an accidental clue? Or worse, Why had someone put that pen there, and in that position? I began carefully lifting the papers around, and noticed that under the book, in what looked like a sliding drawer, there were remnants of a letter partially hidden. A yellowed, wrinkled paper with almost smudged ink, as if it had suffered years of neglect. But moisture and time had not erased a couple of lines suffering and confessing something. I read it with a touch of anguish. Words like fear, secret, "I can't take it anymore," echoed in my mind. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room grew dense, and with each line I read, the story became less clear and more disturbing. The letter was not fully inside the drawer. I barely found the corner, which made me imagine that maybe someone had tried to get rid of it or cover it up, hide it in plain sight. My instinct told me there was more, something that didn't fit a simple death, a story without complications. That letter, that pen, and the book open in the middle of the page made me remember that in cases of death that seem clear at first glance, there are almost always invisible layers that unfold if one stops to observe in detail. I was meticulous, measured every centimeter, photographed the positions, and took samples lucidly. Reconstructing the scene was like assembling a puzzle with scattered and missing pieces. I requested that while I continued the examination, a team review recordings from nearby cameras or any other technological evidence, like phones or computers. The usual routine. However, upon inspecting Javier's desk, I discovered something even more baffling. His laptop was open, the screen locked, but with some application running in the background. I asked for permission to unlock it, and every time we entered the wrong password, I felt a growing sense that the answer I needed was there. After several attempts, and with the help of specialized technology, we managed to access some recent emails and messages. It was a discreet, almost secret conversation between Javier and someone named L, where the words were cautious and tense. There were references to the meeting, the threat, and "we cannot fail." I couldn't believe what I was discovering. Apparently, that calm man who seemed to have fallen asleep forever lived under enormous, veiled, and dangerous pressure that no one in his immediate environment had perceived. But the worst was when I identified an attached audio file titled confession.mp3, which I listened to with headphones in the living room. Javier's voice sounded nervous, restrained, but clear in his words. He spoke of something he had witnessed and could not reveal without paying a high price. He began naming people and places that made me understand he was in the middle of a much more dangerous and complicated plot than a simple accident. The fear and unease I had detected in the letter multiplied exponentially. The next day, while waiting for the preliminary autopsy results, I reviewed more photographs of the apartment, and there it was, another irregularity that had gone unnoticed by the first people at the scene. A small footprint, almost invisible, marked with dirt and dust, was on a frame of the window that looked out onto a backyard, a small space rarely used. That footprint seemed very fresh, incompatible with the lack of movement in the rest of the apartment. I raised a magnifying glass and compared it to other prints. Although there were not many to compare, then we took DNA samples that we confirmed belonged to a third party, someone who didn't live there but had entered or left strangely. That clue changed everything. Each finding was a spark that ignited a dark path not appearing in any initial report, and less so in the accounts from family or neighbors. I began to think that perhaps Javier was not alone the last night, that invisible forces were manipulating the facts. All those details, the pen, the letter, the computer, and that out-of-place footprint, were blending into a hidden truth that, far from being simple, was embedded in a web where nothing was what it seemed at first glance. The patience to review every small piece, to leave nothing overlooked, seemed to bring to the surface not only the cause of death, but the reason and the murky environment behind it. The chill grew when, upon checking security camera footage near his building, I found that in the early hours of that night, a black van had appeared and was parked for a couple of hours very close by, with no visible movement to alert anyone. However, it was not listed in any report or known identity, and the plate had been artificially altered, as they wanted to conceal it. It was known that in Mexico City, such actions were not unusual, but finding them embedded in an apparently simple case was unsettling. The connection between that and the small pen circled again in my mind, and I understood that that object, without needing screams or stains, was pointing to a lie. Hours passed, days, until finally the autopsy results allowed me to move forward. Javier did not die of natural causes. The clean scene and lack of visible wounds did not exclude an indirect and refined action. The examination revealed tiny traces of a rare sedative, difficult to detect, that had caused a slow but fatal respiratory failure. Someone had calmed him so he wouldn't fight back. That explained the calmness of the place and the absence of visible violence. A death orchestrated from silence and concealment. Suddenly, that detail of the mispositioned pen seemed like a sign not to forget the invisible, to look beyond the limit of what lies before us. I wanted to talk to the family to understand more about the man who seemed calm and carefree, but their story was full of contradictions and gaps. No one knew about the audio, the letter, or the secret conversations. No one expected that death, much less in that way. While reconstructing that dark story I had encountered in front of Javier's impassive face, I became aware of the vast distance between what appears and what truly happens, and how, in my profession, that distance marks the difference between truth and lies. The pen, the object no one saw, taught me an important lesson. Nothing is as clear as it seems, and only those who persevere can bring light into the darkest shadows. While waiting for final toxicology results to be confirmed, I decided to take a step further. I knew that in cases like this, where death seemed accidental until a small detail revealed otherwise, patience and thoroughness were my best allies. The feeling that there was much more behind that seemingly harmless object, that pen placed upside down, did not leave me. It was as if someone, in the midst of that absolute silence, wanted to leave a sign for someone with keen eyes to discover the truth hidden in the echo of emptiness. I reviewed recordings and data carefully again, this time extending the scope to earlier that night, and also the previous days. I found patterns of strange movements, intermittent phone calls, messages written and deleted on social media, fleeting visits recorded by neighbors, and a series of mysterious encounters that would have gone unnoticed at first glance. It turned out that Javier had abruptly changed his routine weeks before dying. He had avoided former acquaintances, and more disturbingly, an unknown number appeared constantly in his call logs, always at unusual hours, almost at midnight, just when the darkness thickened the silence on the streets. The analysis team, on the other hand, revealed something definitely disturbing. The dust and soil samples found on the footprint on the window frame matched a very specific place in an abandoned warehouse several blocks from Javier's apartment. That warehouse had been closed to the public for years, but strangely, through thermal sensors and subsequent inspections, we detected signs of recent activity. Stealthy movements, people going in and out, objects stored and then quickly removed. That footprint, which seemed an absurd detail on the pristine floor of an apartment, was actually the first tangible physical clue of a much more complex and dark scenario. Then, another reality struck. An anonymous witness came forward, a neighbor who didn't dare to speak at first, but finally delivered crucial information. He had seen Javier arguing heatedly with a tall man dressed in black near the window overlooking the backyard, just a few hours before he was found dead. The description was vague, but the witness also claimed to have seen that man placing something on the window, right above the frame where the footprints later appeared. It was clear. There was a message, an object, a signal hidden in that tiny detail. I immediately remembered the pen. It was not just a pen. It was a message, a mark for someone to know that place had been touched, manipulated. This, however, raised more questions than answers. Why was Javier involved in something so obvious and dangerous? Who was that man in black, and what role did he play in this whole story? I tried to cross-reference data with the information from the audio file confession.mp3 and conversations with L, the mysterious person on the computer. It seemed clear it was not merely blackmail or a common threat. He was involved in a network of corruption or shady business dealings that Javier's death had exposed, but that at the same time was protected by a veil of secrets and palpable fear. Suddenly, I saw the other side of the matter. Javier's family, who insisted on denying any contact with dangerous people, seemed to be lying or at least hiding important details. His mother, a rigid and controlling woman, tried to minimize information about the letter and denied that Javier had problems, but her nervousness was evident. His wife, more discreet, assured that nothing out of the ordinary had happened, but her eyes reflected a mixture of sadness and alertness, as if she feared we were getting too close to a truth that could destroy everything they had built together. In that thick and sinister atmosphere, I decided to review the letter again, the one I found almost forgotten under book, and noticed something about the handwriting that I hadn't perceived before. The first lines had a different pressure, as if they had been written at different moments, in very varied emotional states. The confession contained beyond the words expressed a murmuring urgency, desperate. It was not just a plea, it was a veiled warning. Javier had been trapped in a situation beyond his control, and the only way to try to escape was to leave pieces of a puzzle that only someone with enough time and will could solve. As the investigation progressed, I considered that perhaps the pen was a signal directed at someone beyond the obvious, maybe a cry for help, a clue so that a hidden message in the correspondence or the objects found could be uncovered. I started looking in Javier's personal belongings for more than just a pen and the letter. I found an agenda, hidden in a secret compartment among his things, where there were barely legible notes, phone numbers, encrypted names, crossed-out dates, and many other puzzling clues. Each page seemed like a code that could only be deciphered with patience and understanding of the context in which that man had lived his last months. That agenda turned out to be a beacon in the darkness. There were traces of secret meetings, people with false identities, and references to compromised legal documents. I knew that behind those notes was something Javier feared more than anyone at that moment. There was a threat, not only physical but symbolic, aiming to destroy his reputation and possibly his life. However, the most disturbing thing was the constant presence of that invisible creature that moves the pieces in the shadows. Corruption that in Mexico City permeates not only the streets but institutions, businesses, and everyday lives. When I finally listened to a full recording of the audio, Confession.mp3, I understood that Javier was not just an accidental victim, but someone who had chosen, at the last moment, to leave a testimony of the reality that haunted him. His voice trembled as he mentioned names, but showed a tragic determination to leave evidence. He said he was being pressured to participate in an illegal act linked to politicians and businessmen, and had decided to break the silence to protect those who could be affected. However, he knew that gesture would cost him dearly. His death was not an accident, but a message to those who dare to challenge that closed and dangerous system. After analyzing this accumulation of evidence, I couldn't avoid feeling the weight of so many lives marked by hidden intentions. That pen, placed upside down, was perhaps a last warning, a distress signal that seemed small to the eyes but gigantic in meaning. The inverted position represented a symbol of alarm, an invitation to look carefully at what others wanted to keep invisible. Because in this story, as in many others that cross my path, death is not just an end but a beginning of a search for truth. While processing this whirlwind of information, someone from the police alerted me about an anonymous call that could change everything. We arranged to meet at midnight in a nearby park, a secluded and apparently quiet place. It was an invitation to continue that search in the shadows, among secrets and lurking threats. For a moment I hesitated, aware of the danger lurking, but my commitment to truth and Javier's memory pushed me to accept. That night, under the dim light of the street lamps, while I waited alone for that unknown person, I could feel the full dimension of what I had discovered. A parallel universe of silences, lies, and silences broken by a misplaced pen. The truth, I concluded, is not a straight or comfortable path. Many times it is a dark and rugged trail, where patience and attention to the smallest details become indispensable weapons. That investigation, which began as a routine case, had transformed into a lesson that would mark me forever. Nothing is out of place without reason, and in that pen I found a voice asking to be heard, a death demanding justice, a mystery no one wanted to see. And I was determined to keep seeing, to keep searching, because in forensics, as in life, the objects nobody saw are sometimes the ones that tell the whole story. The clock moved forward slowly as I waited for the figure I had summoned to that dark park to show up. Every noise, every whisper of the wind through the leaves, became for me a possible clue or threat. It wasn't the first time I faced moments like these, with my heart racing and my mind oscillating between caution and the need to move forward. But that night felt different, something that seemed to announce I was about to cross a threshold. Because that investigation had ceased to be a mere professional exercise and had become a personal struggle, a skin that clung to me warmly and said, with a silent but firm voice, that what was at stake was much more than the life of one man. It was the credibility, justice, even the dignity of all those we represented with our work. When, finally, a shadow emerged from among the trees, my breath caught and my instinct sharpened. The figure approached with steady steps and, when speaking, their voice was low, almost a whisper, but charged with urgency and fear. "It's not safe to continue alone," they said with a touch of weariness but also determination. They warned me that people were watching, that the implications were far greater than they seemed, and that the inverted pen was nothing more than the first symbol of a much larger and more dangerous network that Javier, unknowingly, had managed to penetrate. They handed me a folder containing documents with names, dates, photographic evidence, and even conversations pointing to a web of corruption involving public officials and powerful business people able to manipulate the law and silence inconvenient voices. Tension rose like an unstoppable wave. With every page I reviewed, I understood that this man, Javier, had endured a storm few and far between in my years as a forensic expert. A personal blow crossed by the brutality of a corrupt system that often hid behind impeccable official records. And the most terrifying part was realizing those hands manipulating that reality weren't afraid to get dirty. That network, invisible to most, spread like a shadow covering not only those directly involved, but also those willing to ask questions or seek the truth. I returned to Javier's apartment, examining every corner over and over, searching with the patience only obsession can grant, for any other coded greeting, any other object inverted, or out of place that might go unnoticed. That's when I found a small inscription engraved on the inner edge of the pen's cap, almost imperceptible, some initials and a date. They were neither casual nor part of the game. This was a mark of ownership, a hidden signature, a code that had to be deciphered. I spent hours tracing the meaning. Those initials corresponded to a name linked to a public figure who had been mentioned days earlier in the letter as part of the great corrupt machinery Javier had confronted. The early morning advanced, and with it, my obsession grew. I thought of Javier as fear, the courage he must have gathered to write those lines and leave that pen as a beacon for anyone with the will to follow him. I wondered how many times he had felt trapped, locked in an invisible cage woven with threats and coercive silences. The idea that someone had tried to manipulate the scene to make everything appear as an accident grew stronger with each step. This was not just a medical case. It was a plot with too many edges, a tangle almost impossible to unravel without sacrificing something along the way. As the night fell asleep in its shadows, I remembered a late conversation I had with Javier's wife. Her worry carried a difficult-to-describe nuance. At times, she seemed ready to confess, but her fear of gossip and the risk of exposure made her retreat. She told me that in recent weeks, Javier had been receiving threatening messages, not only by phone but also anonymous notes appearing in his mailbox and belongings. That detail, small for others, was a crucial piece for me. The pressure had materialized in almost cinematic forms, in symbols and signals warning that someone wanted Javier to keep quiet. That growing tension, which at first seemed a rumor or paranoia, had turned into a staircase that ultimately led him to death. With that fresh information, I felt I had to return to the abandoned warehouse for which the prints on the window had come. I convinced the forensic team and investigators to accompany me despite warnings. We knew that place had secrets that could change the course of the investigation. Upon arrival, the early morning cold seeped even through the thickest clothes, and the silence was barely broken by an isolated sound that made the mysterious atmosphere tremble. We searched thoroughly, careful not to contaminate the scene, and then we found signs of a clandestine meeting. Scattered documents, traces of adhesive tape, and what appeared to be a map marked with locations corresponding to government offices and private companies. Everything indicated that the warehouse had served as a meeting point or distribution center for illegal activities related to the network Javier had denounced. However, the most shocking discovery was an old videocassette found in a dusty box with an illegible label. I requested it be played in the lab, and seeing it, I was paralyzed by the harshness of the images. It was a clandestine recording with barely lit shadows, where voices confirmed the existence of illegal agreements, bribes, and plans to silence opponents, including, clearly, Javier. The evidence was devastating, an audio-visual testimony challenging powerful figures and explaining many of the threats and suspicious moves detected during the investigation. From there, the pressure, increased exponentially. The anonymous calls I received grew more insistent, with veiled warnings and ambiguous messages demonstrating that someone else was following my steps and wanted me to give up. But my commitment outweighed the fear. That silent voice I deciphered in the inverted pen was more present than ever. Javier's story, his fears, his secrets, were now mine too, and the certainty that his death had served to expose that corruption kept me steadfast. For weeks, the case was a roller coaster of advances and setbacks. There were moments when it seemed everything was about to collapse, when witnesses who dared to speak disappeared or recanted, and we kept uncovering political corpses buried under impenetrable layers of silence. But flashes of clarity also appeared, lost documents resurfacing, testimonies from people with tired but brave eyes, and above all, the unbreakable trail of that pen that seemed to be a flag amid the chaos. I found myself involved in clandestine meetings, invisible negotiations, and sleepless nights. In every encounter, every conversation, I sought to protect that truth that seemed to be killing Javier and many others before him. But at the same time, I understood how thin the line is between doing justice and risking one's own convictions and life. That tiny sign that seemed just a misplaced object was the symbol of a bigger struggle, and I knew many did not want that struggle to continue. One afternoon, while reviewing the recordings again, I noticed an anomaly in the light of the room where Javier was found. Small, almost imperceptible reflections suggested there was more on that window than presumed. I requested a forensic analysis with ultraviolet light, and what appeared was a list of numbers written with invisible ink on the window frame, right beneath the dirt print. It was a code, a place, a time for a meeting not recorded in any agenda or phone. That new clue triggered an operation that lasted all night, where the authorities, with extreme discretion, managed to capture a group that was part of a corrupt network, trying to erase crucial evidence. That operation, however, also marked a point of no return. The reprisal became tangible, and I myself received much more direct threats. But the equanimity that had accompanied me since I found that inverted pen sustained me. Javier had left a message I could no longer ignore or leave in the dark. The objects that no one saw, the tiny details most overlook, are often the keys to open the doors of what seems inexplicable. And it was not only about discovering how he died, but about understanding why, for what purpose, and against whom. Thus, among documents, shadows, and muted voices, I continued unearthing the story someone tried to erase with a murder and imposed silence. It was not just a forensic case, but a commitment to the memory and truth that Javier dared to offer, silently, through that misplaced pen, that clandestine note, and that gaze that did not surrender despite fear. Now I'm convinced that in every investigation there is a hidden story waiting to be told, an insignificant object that can be the piece that reveals everything. Because, in the end, justice lies not only in physical evidence, but in the human ability to see, listen, and have the courage to act when others prefer to look away. That night in the park, that anonymous call, and that inverted pen not only changed the course of the case, but reminded me, more than ever, that truth, no matter how small it seems, always finds a way to become visible. And I, as a forensic expert, as a human being, must be willing to discover it, no matter the cost, because that is the reason for my work and the profound meaning behind every death I analyze. Every new piece of information seemed to fit into a puzzle far more imposing than I initially imagined. The network Javier had penetrated was an almost perfect spiderweb, carefully woven by those who controlled circles whose power was measured not only in money, but in absolute control of information and decisions affecting thousands of people. The evidence I gathered not only pointed specific individuals, but revealed an entire mechanism, where every cog turned in sync to maintain a facade of legitimacy. Understanding it, assimilating it, and acting on it demanded more than technical knowledge. It meant a constant confrontation with my limits, my fears, and the awareness that this could cost me more than I ever wanted to admit. There were nights when the house felt like a mausoleum. I returned from reviewing documents, interviewing witnesses, analyzing security cameras, and sat in silence, trying to organize the avalanche of information. Every time I watched a recording we had found, a new detail emerged, a gesture, a word, a barely visible face that seemed to insist I not forget it. The harshness of those images left me with a feeling that was not only professional, but deeply human. I couldn't get Javier's image out of my mind, the face distorted by fear and the firmness with which he seemed to challenge those threatening him. It was clear he knew the risk he was taking, but somehow decided to continue, perhaps hoping someone would hear that coded message. The inverted pen, which at first seemed like just a mistake, had been a discreet signal, a silent scream amidst the imposed silence. For weeks, I searched for connections to other cases, to those deaths that the official record classified as accidental or without apparent cause. I discovered Javier was not the first to pay with his life for trying to expose that network, and that made the paranoia grow. More than once, I felt eyes watching me, stealthy steps following me outside the office, the shadow of danger closer than I could afford to admit. As I approached the turning point, an unexpected twist shook the investigation. An anonymous call came in the middle of a particularly quiet night. This time, the voice was clearer, much less fearful than before. Trust no one. What you found is about to shake the foundations of those who built their fortunes with impunity, it said. And before I could respond, the line went dead. It was a blunt message, a warning that nonetheless reinforced the idea that the path, though dangerous, had to advance with caution. I decided to trust only my instinct and those who already trusted me. I couldn't allow paranoia to paralyze me. That call motivated me to take a step I had avoided until then, starting to cross-check information with confidential databases to which I only had access with special permissions. Thanks to that, I was able to track strange financial movements, transfers that made no apparent sense but matched the names linked to the network. It was like discovering a second hidden layer beneath the entanglement I already knew. I understood that corruption was not only a matter of bribes, but a sophisticated machinery using shell companies, luxury homes under third-party names, and even foundations with philanthropic purposes as a facade. Javier, unknowingly, had managed to gather fragments of that structure thanks to his own connections and the opportunity provided by his profession. But time was not on my side. The pressures kept increasing, along with the feeling of vulnerability. On one occasion, I found my home with objects out of place, as if someone had been snooping in my life intent on sowing fear. The police offered protection, but for me, the most important thing was to keep calm and not let fear make me make mistakes. I often remember what Javier's wife told me, that courage is often not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. That phrase became a mantra during those endless weeks. One night, just when I believed we had found the climax, I received an unexpected invitation to a clandestine meeting. Not knowing if it was a trap or an opportunity, I decided to go with a couple of trusted agents. The place was far from downtown, an old house that seemed abandoned but showed clear signs of regular use. There, a person who identified themselves with a code name handed me a flash drive with information that could break the network from within. It contained names, dates, and documentary evidence implicating several high-ranking officials, as well as clearing doubts about the direct involvement of certain businessmen in illicit activities. It was a breakthrough that could mean a victory, but also a sentence if it fell into the wrong hands. When I returned to the office, the atmosphere became even tenser. The team knew we were touching a deep wound, and that any wrong move could be fatal. Drafting the report exposing that corruption was not just a technical act, but a risky one, a direct challenge to those who believed themselves untouchable. Every word had to be backed by irrefutable evidence because the power we faced was willing to do anything to maintain silence. It was the hardest phase of the entire investigation, balancing precision with caution, the right to justice with the reality of danger. There were times I thought of quitting, of letting the case be buried and forgotten, but every time I did, I remembered Javier's image in his silent struggle. I clung to that idea like a beacon. Even when one night, a car accident on my way home made me fear I wouldn't be here to tell this story, I understood that risk was part of the path, and that silence only benefits those who exploit impunity. I knew I had to continue, that justice, though sometimes slow, carries the strength of those who don't give up. We made contact with some trustworthy media outlets, without revealing too much, so the complaint wouldn't remain just a report. That controlled dissemination acted as a shield, because public opinion became a partial witness to what we were uncovering. As social pressure grew, more people began to open up, to talk, to provide data and testimonies confirming the sinister network of manipulation and violence. The chain of silence began to break, and although the risks did not diminish, I felt the truth starting to gain ground. Finally, after months of investigation, testimony, and review, the first arrests were made. It was a significant blow, but not the end. I knew there were still many loose ends in that web. That corruption is like a cancer seeking to regenerate. However, that operation proved that justice is possible, that perseverance and attention to detail, like that seemingly insignificant object that no one saw, can become the cornerstone to tear down solid walls. That experience left a mark on me forever. I learned that beyond science and forensic rigor, there is a human dimension rarely recognized. The ability to listen to untold stories, to read between the lines, and to be willing to challenge not only the system but also our own fears. Javier taught me that every object, no matter how small, can be a silent scream, a testimony as powerful as a word spoken aloud. Now, when I look back at that inverted pen, I don't just see a technical clue, but a symbol of resistance. I know that as long as there is someone willing to see, to search, and to ask, the truth will never be completely hidden. This story doesn't end here because justice is a flame that must be constantly fed. And although I have learned that shadows lurk in every corner, I have also confirmed that light, however faint, always finds its way. Every case confirms to me that it's not only the body that speaks, but the objects, the crumbs of truth hidden in the details. Javier, though silent, continue speaking through that pen, and as long as I have the strength to keep listening, his story, and that of so many others, will not remain in the dark. That is the true essence of being a forensic expert. Giving voice to those who can no longer tell their truth, uncovering the invisible, and fighting every day so that justice is more than an empty word. And so, amid shadows and revelations, I remain here, convinced that every object no one saw, every forgotten detail, is a door to the truth that deserves to be found. Because in that quest, more than science, there is humanity. Because in the end, that is what turns a simple forensic expert into a guardian of memory and a sentinel of justice. As I progressed with the information I had obtained, each new piece dragged me deeper into an abyss of contradictions and secrets that seemed endless. What began as a search for answers surrounding Javier's death had turned into unraveling a mechanism so complex and meticulous that any wrong move could trigger a catastrophe for everyone involved, including myself. That feeling of constant surveillance, which at first seemed like a distant whisper, started to become more tangible, more oppressive, as if the very walls around me wanted to warn me with every sound and shadow that I was not alone in this battle. The flash drive I was handed in that old house was a cultural and political bombshell. Every file, every scanned document, every bank transfer I traced through that data revealed a pattern of systemic corruption, deeper and more penetrating than anyone would admit out loud. The names that appeared were not mere intermediaries or low-level employees. They reached officials responsible for national security, political figures in key positions, and businessmen involved in ventures that on the surface seemed legitimate but were actually fronts for illicit operations. It was then that I realized what I had uncovered could shake the very structure in which many place their trust. But evidence was not enough without context. It wasn't just a matter of presenting papers or documents. Every figure, every strange movement had to be clearly linked to concrete actions and real consequences, and that required following an invisible thread woven through time. I began to investigate previous cases that at first seemed isolated but now made sense. Disappearances, unexplained accidents, deaths that didn't match the official version. Javier had been brave to question those truths, risking his life to open a path toward the light many wanted to keep hidden. And that light, I understood, had to include not only justice for him, but for all those whose voices were silenced amid the noise imposed by power. The pressure grew every day. My circle tightened, and confidences were whispered with fear. On one occasion, a contact within the administration warned me of plans to halt the investigation, using all possible resources, including direct threats, something that no longer sounded like mere paranoia. The reality was that the corruption network not only devoured those trying to expose it, but also sought to control those on the verge of revealing its rot. The actions of those managing that web had no scruples, and as a forensic expert, the thought that fear could paralyze me or make me lose focus lingered in my mind. But the image of Javier remained there, firm and defiant, reminding me that the truth defines not just life or death, but our honor and the memory of those who no longer have a voice. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. One of the most disturbing findings was discovering that some financial operations passed through intermediaries living under falsified identities, people who existed only on very well-crafted documents. Phantom companies, properties with fraudulent contracts, and charitable activities that, far from providing help, functioned as money laundering hubs. The sophistication was such that even when it seemed I was reaching the core, a new wall always emerged, a new double bottom hiding another layer of the truth. There were days I felt like I was fighting a mythological monster with many heads, where every cut would make two more sprout. The fear never disappeared, but I learned to use it to keep my clarity at its peak. Seeking the truth in this kind of investigation is neither quick nor easy. It means making controlled decisions, moving cautiously, and above all, being aware that missteps come at a high cost. I remembered how the pen left inverted at the crime scene was not simply a lapse, but the first call for help in a silent storm. From then on, I understood that every piece of data, no matter how useless it seemed at first glance, could be the vital link that triggered the entire chain. It was a dangerous but unavoidable game because what was at stake far exceeded my own safety. The anonymous call I received was a storm in the midst of apparent calm. I knew that warning came not just from someone who shared the concern, but from someone who also felt the weight of the wall the system imposed to silence what it knew. That insistent voice, though faceless, was tied to the few allies who still trusted justice as an ideal. That call reminded me that despite the complexity and risk, I was not alone. There was a hidden network of people willing to risk everything, even their lives, every day for a less corrupt world. In those moments, my perspective shifted. It was no longer just Javier's voice or the fervor of a shocking crime, but commitment to those who, over time, had fallen into darkness for trying to sound the alarm. In that silence, I found renewed strength that drove me not to yield to fatigue or fear and to keep assembling the report with surgical precision. With the team's help, we created comparative charts, timelines, relationship maps between people and companies, all presented with relentless clarity. There was no room for doubt or external interpretations. What we held was a case capable of toppling giants. However, that clarity translated into even greater danger. I realized the network we faced had ears everywhere, and as soon as our actions became visible, the shadow began moving swiftly, trying to anticipate us. My car suffered intentional damage, and no matter how much the protectors promised security, uncertainty settled into every movement. Yet, it was in those moments of vulnerability that my purpose had to be clearest. Justice is not a path for the brave without fear, but for those who decide to be brave despite it. In the darkness, I learned to find my way. That clandestine delivery of information was a turning point that not only brought evidence, but also risks that materialized almost immediately. The team and I had to strengthen our communication, move through less predictable circuits, and prepare for possible legal or physical attacks. That flash drive now carried an almost religious symbolic value, a testimony capable of toppling the guilty and opening new investigations. Sharing that information with impartial but careful authorities was not easy, because the power we faced also knew how to use the law to protect itself. That is why the strategy included secretly synchronizing with journalists in independent investigations, laying strong foundations while carefully managing timing and steps. It was exhausting and distressing, but seeing how little by little the names of the implicated fell onto the arrest list gave me a breath I hadn't felt in a long time. Still, it was only the beginning. There were open wounds in society, in the administration, and in public trust that required time to heal. Corruption, as I well learned, is not a momentary evil, but a chronic patient that can return with a single lapse in vigilance. That is why insisting on every detail, keeping the flame of denunciation alive, and not allowing the case to become just another story buried under papers and files was a responsibility I accepted with conviction that no one else would do it with that intention. At night, when I turned off the light and the house fell silent, I still felt the burden, the weight of the case on my shoulders, but also the warmth of justice drawing near, like a river slowly eroding the hardest rock. I remembered every face, every word, and reminded myself that this was not just a job, but a cause with a human face. Javier's memory, his pen inverted amid the chaos, was now the emblem of resistance against imposed silence. My experience taught me that in the forensic world, the most valuable skill is not technique or accumulated knowledge, but the sensitivity to read between the shadows of the apparent, the attention to discover the object no one saw, the uncomfortable gesture, the irregularity prejudicially ignored. Because behind every corpse, every scene, there is a story that refuses to die, and it is in our hands, professionals and citizens alike, to choose whether that story remains incomplete or finally finds the justice it deserves. Deep down, I know this is not a definitive victory nor closure. It is merely a chapter in the ongoing struggle for a fairer and more transparent Mexico. But I also know that every time someone, despite fear and threats, decides to face the truth, a door opens for others to continue. That inverted pen, that hidden signal at the scene, now stands as a symbol to never accept easy answers, never settle for official versions, and always seek the invisible beyond the evident. I remain here with that lesson burned into me. Justice is a long and complex path, but every discovered detail, every silent resistance, is another stone in building a world where lives matter and silenced voices can finally be heard. Javier taught me that sometimes it is a simple, forgotten object that makes the difference between oblivion and perpetual memory. And as long as there is someone willing to look beyond, to tirelessly seek those signs, the truth will never truly be lost as I delved deeper into this labyrinth of shadows. The feeling that I was being watched never left me for a moment. The nights became uncomfortable, with barely perceptible noises interrupting my sleep and the growing certainty that someone was watching my every move. Fear ceased to be a fleeting thought and became an almost tangible presence, something coiling around my chest that I had to learn to live with without losing my mind. However, far from paralyzing me, that pressure gave me a kind of cold clarity, as if the risk forced me to sharpen every sense, not leaving the smallest detail to chance. The real battle was not only in the documents or physical evidence, but in the invisible strategy, in the silent game of intelligence and caution, where every anticipated word or careless gesture could be lethal. Weeks passed when I could barely distinguish one day from another. My surroundings shrank to a small circle of trust. A few colleagues who had proven incorruptible, some brave journalists, and, of course, that anonymous voice who gradually revealed names and connections that even the documents hadn't managed to show. It was a meticulous and exhausting process, cross-referencing information, corroborating facts, secretly interviewing sources who often trembled more than I did because the threat to them was real, tangible. Every breakthrough was a breath of relief, but also a warning. The network was alive and defended itself tooth and nail. That feeling of being on a chessboard, where every move was met with an unexpected play, accompanied me constantly. One morning, when reviewing the contents of a flash drive again, one file stood out among the rest, a clandestinely recorded video, with poor quality but enough to show a secret meeting between individuals who, until then, only existed on my list as names. The scene was charged with tension. Low voices balanced the urgency of veiled confessions and hidden agreements. It was something much more compromising, almost scandalous, than any bank document. What I saw there took the entire investigation to a new dimension, because I not only confirmed the corruption, but identified who was pulling the strings beyond the public facade. That revelation was like an internal bomb. On one hand, it gave me the necessary momentum to continue, but on the other, it exponentially increased the level of danger. I had direct, irrefutable evidence that could shake deeply entrenched power structures. But this was no ordinary case. I couldn't just hand it over to the authorities without thinking about the consequences. The distrust toward the justice and security systems, the infiltration of that network within them, was something I had learned over time, and that led me to take extreme precautions. Every step had to be calculated and synchronized with trusted allies. The information had to be filtered and dosed to protect those who received it and avoid losing the trail. For several weeks, I built a way to communicate with independent journalists experienced in corruption issues, willing to work on an exhaustive report with the information I had. That parallel proved fundamental because while we sustained the forensic and judicial investigation, they gave public shape to the scandal. Coordination was meticulous, avoiding common email, using codes, meetings in scarcely frequented places, and ensuring no one followed us. Paranoia became our constant companion, and we almost accepted it as part of the job. Slowly, we assembled a network that held all that truth that so many wanted to hide. Amid this whirlwind, there were moments when I had to face my own limits. The emotional pressure and physical exhaustion made my mind seek escape. The thought of giving up passed through my head as a dangerous temptation. But I always remember the man found in that house, his inverted pen, that signal that few saw, but that for me was a red flag impossible to ignore. I clung to that idea like an anchor. Every time exhaustion seemed to gain ground, I reminded myself that justice is a commitment beyond fatigue, that it is trust placed in invisible details and patience to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of lies. I didn't know if in the end we would dismantle the entire network, but I was sure I couldn't throw in the towel just when the path got tougher. Then the twist in the story came like a jolt. One early morning, while reviewing some financial transactions connected to the case, I noticed strange movements in accounts that hadn't had recent activity until then. They were small transfers, perhaps insignificant at first glance, but linked by a pattern reminiscent of the method used by the network we were investigating to send bribes and finance clandestine operations. I decided to follow them. Doing so, I found they were not just transactions, but encrypted messages, movements that made sense only among certain professionals and operators, a kind of dark code among them to stay hidden. That discovery increased the complexity of the matter. The network was not only corrupt, but extremely clever. Immediately, I knew this lead meant starting a new phase. I had to turn to allied cybersecurity experts who helped me decipher patterns and connections not visible at first glance. The process was a constant back and forth, with sleepless nights and days absorbing data that generated more questions than answers. But it also showed me that corruption is not static. It is not limited to certain names or places. It is a mutant beast that adapts, moving pieces when someone tries to catch it. It was inevitable to feel that this chase took on an almost personal tone, a battle between the visible and the invisible, between truth and hidden lies. Nothing prepared me for what happened days later. The attack stopped being just indirect. One night, leaving my office, I found that my car's suspension had been deliberately damaged, a clear message for me to stop. I stayed calm, trying not to let my instinct to flee take over. I also received anonymous calls, some threatening, others demanding silence. At that moment, I reaffirmed that I was at the breaking point, in the center of a hurricane that could destroy lives, including mine. But I also confirmed I had gone too far to turn back. I had identified faces, names, and accounts. Each piece of evidence was a shot against impunity. And if they wanted to play dirty, I was not going to give in. My team solidified during this crisis. We organized shifts to ensure the investigation wouldn't stop and protect each other. We reinforced security protocols and changed the way we documented progress, taking extreme precautions so that data wouldn't be intercepted. It was a titanic effort, a careful dance between fear and hope. At every step, we had to measure what information could be released and what had to be kept to avoid putting collaborators at risk. I felt the responsibility of carrying not just my story, but the lives and dreams of many who trusted that defending the truth was possible. Amid this storm, there were moments of small relief. News began to filter through independent media, driven by allied journalists. Society started to awaken to the magnitude of the case, and public pressure forced certain government sectors to take measures that until then seemed unthinkable. Preliminary arrests, reviews of illegal contracts, and audits targeting suspects began to appear. It was a breath of fresh air that reminded me that the path of justice can be long, but has moments of light. That sense of justice underway made the fatigue fade for a moment and gave me the strength to keep going. But, to my surprise, the enemies did not wait to counterattack. The same corrupt machinery began launching false accusations against the team, tried to discredit us with smear campaigns, and sow doubt among the public. That was a clear reminder that the battle was not only in courts or fiscal investigations, but also in the realm of perceptions, in controlling the narrative. It was like a subtle, deceptive war, where communication strategy had to be used to prove that truth knows no borders and cannot be silenced by lies. Transparency became a shield, and the commitment to honesty, our best weapon. Meanwhile, inside me, the sense of responsibility grew. I knew that every advance, Every verified document and every protected testimony was not only for me or Javier, but for all the invisible victims of this network. People who had disappeared, families still seeking answers, individuals who had paid with their lives for daring to challenge a corrupt system. In their memory, I found a strength that pushed me to never lower my guard, to keep the flame of justice alive even when darkness seemed to engulf everything. That certainty became my daily engine. Over time, an unexpected pattern emerged among the phrases and figures we analyzed. A recurring name, a persistent link to an apparently innocent company that suddenly became the key piece where dark interests converged. That clue led us to a much deeper surprise, a web of personal and political relationships that had remained out of reach until then. The complexity seemed to grow without limit, and reality showed itself crueler and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Every finding had a price, but stopping was impossible. Javier's case and that pen with the trigger. But what I now had before me was a huge puzzle where each piece represented decades of corruption. Putting order in that chaos was a titanic task, but also a unique opportunity to change course, to give society a bit of trust back. It was not a personal fight, but a collective commitment to memory, truth, and justice. And although I knew the road would be long and full of challenges, I could not allow fear or despair to stand in the way. Looking back, I understand that object, so simple and forgotten by many, was the spark that ignited this whole story. It taught me that in forensic justice and in life itself, the invisible is not irrelevant. Many times, it is a message waiting to be deciphered, the key that opens doors that seem sealed. That is why, whenever I face a case, I try to remind myself that behind every detail, no matter how small it seems, there is a human story, a struggle worthy of respect. Because that is the essence of forensic work. Giving voice to those who no longer have one, reconstructing truth from the shadows to offer a legacy of justice. Although the path remains uncertain and I know the battle is not over, I carry with me the certainty that every step counts, that truth can break through even when it seems impossible, and that as long as there are eyes willing to seek the hidden, justice will never be lost. Javier and his inverted pen left me that legacy, a reminder that attention and patience can transform a simple sign into a revolutionary act capable of defying silence, breaking the wall of fear and restoring hope. And with that lesson, I move forward, ready to look beyond, because truth always awaits to be found. The weight of the secret was a burden that grew more unbearable with each passing day. Sleepless nights were no longer only about the relentless search for clues or the need to organize information, but also about the constant mental review of every detail that might slip from my memory. There was something about that pen, the particular way it was placed, that kept haunting my mind. It wasn't just a disordered object. It was a sign, and as such, it had to hold a deeper meaning than anyone expected. That soft, almost imperceptible stain, which had gone unnoticed by others, was the first crack that opened the door to a truth too big to ignore. From that moment on, every move, every meeting, every clandestine conversation became a delicate balance between progressing and not exposing oneself. Information deliveries came more frequently, but also more carefully. Encrypted messages grew even more complex, and I always had to stay one step ahead, without leaving traces. In this game of shadows and reflections, I understood that patience was not only a virtue, but the only tool that would prevent me from falling into the trap of error. And so, step by step, the pieces began to fit together, painting a huge and worrying picture. What no one expected, not even me, was to discover that some of the people leading the investigation, those I was supposed to trust, had hidden interests tied to the very network we were trying to dismantle. It was a devastating finding, not because of the betrayal itself, but because it meant corruption had infiltrated every corner and that the enemy could be closer than I had imagined. This revelation forced me to rethink methods, to further restrict the circle of trust, and to design a stricter protocol to protect the investigation. Each file was divided into fragments, every meeting held under strict security rules, and every communication was a test of faith in those who still resisted the pressure. In a decisive meeting with one of the journalists, after weeks of suspicion and breaches of trust, we managed to sit down in a small, secluded cafe, away from prying eyes. There, while the rain fell against the windows, I opened for him that folder containing videos and documents revealing the true extent of the network. Upon seeing it, his expression changed. He understood it was not just information for a report, but something much more. It was a responsibility that went beyond mere journalism. And together, we agreed to remain firm and invisible, to move forward even if in the shadows, because we knew that the proper disclosure could be the final blow this corruption needed to fall. But just when it seemed we had control, an unexpected new twist appeared. One of the most reliable sources vanished without a trace. Their last message was cryptic, full of urgency and fear, and there I realized just how much those who dared to speak out were risking their lives. Facing that void was devastating, but also revealing. The network didn't just intimidate, it could systematically eliminate anyone who posed a real threat. That loss made us strengthen protection protocols and, above all, united us as a team in a conviction that grew unbreakable. The truth was a matter of life or death, and there was no turning back. Every step we took, no matter how small, had already become a spark destined to ignite a fire they could not extinguish. With the technological support of cybersecurity specialists, we began uncovering hidden layers within the financial transfers. They were not just money movements, but a coded language revealing a much broader network of complicity than expected. It was like deciphering a secret map, where each node represented a direct link between public officials, businessmen, and operators of all kinds. These connections were not accidental. They were designed to ensure impunity and keep the structure functioning without giving justice the slightest chance to act. The discovery was overwhelming and, to some extent, disconcerting because it showed how corruption had learned to protect itself behind virtually impenetrable systems. The following weeks were marked by growing tension. Surveillance intensified around my movements, and warning signs became clearer. Suspicious vehicles parked near my office, calls with silence on the other end, even the inexplicable presence of people who seemed to be watching me from a distance. My family also began to feel the weight of this veiled threat, and although I tried to keep them out of it, the truth was that fear crept into every conversation and every look. Loneliness became a constant enemy, but also a companion that forced me to be stronger. It was in that context that I had to make difficult decisions. The integrity of the case depended on careful disclosure, but public exposure could endanger essential collaborators. That's why we chose small, calculated leaks, selective information that would create pressure without compromising security. The strategy worked, and the first social reactions began to appear in protests and public demands. People were waking up, and I felt that justice, although slow, was beginning to move, but that same visibility also put us in the crosshairs of the enemies. The corruption network did not respond only with threats. Its media manipulation arm launched campaigns to discredit journalists, distort facts, and sow doubt among the public. It was a dirty, meticulous job, and at times it seemed impossible to counter. However, there was a moment that changed the game, a leaked audio anonymously obtained, where one of the network's leaders was heard debating how to deal with the forensic problem. That recording, though fragmentary, confirmed that I was a calculated target and represented a real threat to their plans. The case ceased to be just an investigative file and became a personal matter, a direct confrontation between those of us fighting for the truth and those clinging to silence and impunity. This impact had a dual effect. On one hand, pressure increased. On the other, it solidified the entire team's determination. We organized clandestine meetings to protect those at risk, designed security routes for movements, and created protocols for digital protection. Paranoia became an ally. Every suspicious noise, every strange gesture was analyzed without rest. But even amid this extreme tension, the feeling of progress gave us hope, because we knew that the truth was not only our mission, but the most powerful weapon against entrenched corruption. The wear and tear was inevitable, not only physical but also emotional. There were days when uncertainty and pressure seemed to darken the path. Doubt crept into my thoughts with questions that had no answers. Would it be enough? What would happen when all this came to light? Would there be unexpected consequences? In those dark hours, I returned to that initial scene, the man in his home and his inverted pen, and understood that this sign, as small as it was a silent battle against indifference, a confirmation that justice is built in details, in patient waiting, and in the firmness not to let the truth get lost in the noise. We moved forward, step by step. Journalistic leaks began to resonate within institutions, And for the first time, I saw signs of concrete changes. Delays in contracts, cancellations of shady deals, investigations open into involved officials, but also cyber attacks against our system, media campaigns painting us as the culprits, and a constant war aimed at wearing us down to break our will. The reality was that the enemy would not surrender easily, and every small victory implied a very dangerous counterattack. The most striking moment was when we discovered that the seemingly innocent company, the piece that appeared unrelated to everything, was actually the backbone connecting all those involved in the network. Huge amounts of money and political decisions moved from its core. This revelation was a leap forward in the investigation because it showed that corruption had faces, clear identities, and a sophisticated structure designed to protect itself from scrutiny. Understanding this complexity helped design better strategies to confront the network and prove they were not invincible. In this process, I rediscovered that forensic work is not only about analyzing bodies or crime scenes, but about silently witnessing human stories. Truths hidden in every gesture, every out-of-place object, every report. That experience taught me that leading such a case means taking on a bigger mission, a commitment to society. And although the path is full of shadows and dangers, it is a struggle worth every sacrifice. And so, while the investigation continues, I keep remembering Javier and his pen, the spark that ignited everything and ultimately showed me that justice is not a destination, but a path built with patience, attention, and the courage to see what others do not want to look at. In this web of secrets and silences, we not only uncovered a network of corruption, but also the power of truth, a beacon that, though flickering, never goes out. And I know that as long as there are eyes like mine and hands willing to unravel the invisible, that light will keep guiding us toward a new dawn where justice is more than just a word. I never imagined to what extent a simple pen could trigger a chain of events. That nearly invisible stain was a catalyst that began to destabilize a structure so complex that, at first, it seemed impenetrable. From that moment on, every detail took on a dimension unknown to me, and that became more evident each day. Behind the small and seemingly innocuous, there was a world woven with threads of deception, fear, and power. The weeks following that discovery were a constant back and forth between uncertainty and revelation. Every new clue seemed to open a door to an even darker and more complicated passage. I learned to read between the lines, to listen to what was left unsaid, to interpret signs that only experience and intuition can grasp. I worked long hours, sometimes without rest, convinced that every lost second was an opportunity for this network to rearrange itself, to erase evidence, to destroy what we had so painstakingly uncovered. But it wasn't just the physical pieces or graphics that began to change. I started noticing the direct effect on people. Colleagues who had once been enthusiastic began to distance themselves. Evasive glances, vague answers, calls that suddenly got cut off. I knew that more than one person was trapped in an intangible web, a tangle of compromises and threats that we were only beginning to understand in its full magnitude. The game was no longer just at the crime scene or in the false accounting, but in the lives of those trying to walk away and dismantle that monster. I remember a specific moment that marked a turning point. One early morning, while reviewing some digital files that had just arrived, I found a video that seemed like a homemade recording. The quality was poor, but the message was clear and chilling. Secret meetings were shown, whispered conversations, and the presence of characters I never thought I'd see linked to that network. The most unsettling part was hearing, without clearly seeing, one of those involved mention names and dates that matched events that until then made no sense to us. It was as if someone had opened a window right in the heart of that hidden fortress. That recording not only confirmed our suspicions, but gave us the clue to connect actors, places, and moments with terrifying precision. As we tried to digest this new evidence, the tension outside the laboratory grew by leaps and bounds. Surveillance became more aggressive, more visible and constant. Sometimes I felt that the shadow following my movements was so close that one false step could mean the difference between moving forward or disappearing without a trace. However, the team and I wrapped ourselves in that shared determination, reckless though it was, that kept us standing. We knew we were not alone and that the truth could be a heavy burden, but also an unbeatable flame. One of the most complex battles was managing leaks. It was clear that if the information was not handled carefully, We could endanger not only the investigation, but the lives of those who had decided to risk everything to tell what they knew. That is why every piece of data that went public was carefully calibrated, like a chess game where moving one piece too many could change the whole board. At first, the public response was hopeful and full of support. But over time, we realized that the networks of power would soon counterattack with every resource at their disposal. The psychological was evident. Paranoia, distrust, and exhaustion that seemed endless took hold of us day after day. There were moments when I wondered if it was all worth it, if this fight against such a vast and elusive enemy could have a just ending. Uncertainty was a constant companion, but I always returned to that image, the pen, that simple, out-of-place object, upside down, with an almost invisible stain, which to me was a symbol of a clear truth amid chaos. I clung to the idea that those small signs were the only real weapon against a system determined to remain hidden, and that could only be deciphered with patience, care, and a watchful eye. An unexpected move changed everything again when one of the closest members of our team became the direct target of an intimidation that was hard to ignore. There were no blows or direct threats, only subtle but brutal signals in their environment. Something as simple as finding a strange drawing on their front door or noticing that their car had been meticulously inspected by strangers. That situation forced us to rethink logistics, implement stricter protection protocols, and above all, take care of those on the front line. Amid that climate of pressure, I learned that vulnerability was also a point of strength when faced with honesty and courage. At the same time, our network of collaborators grew organically through whispers and clandestine meetings. We found journalists willing to expose themselves, activists with voice and courage, and technology experts who helped us keep danger at bay. It was almost a miracle that such a diverse group could stay united in the face of so many threats. We became a small family, very aware that the enemy had unimaginable resources, but also that our strength lay in truth and transparency. One episode one remember particularly clearly happened on a rainy night, when I received an encrypted message indicating the location of a meeting with a source who, until that moment, had remained anonymous. The appointment was in a little travel park, and the wind seemed to carry a foreboding sense of danger. That man had information that could definitively dismantle the network, but it also put our security at risk. We met, exchanged documents and data discreetly, and before saying goodbye, he warned me not to trust anyone beyond our innermost circle. It was a brutal reminder of how alone we could be, but also the responsibility resting on our shoulders. The leak of the audio where one of the network leaders explicitly spoke about the forensic problem was another huge blow. It confirmed that I was a target, and that all the work we had been doing had put us in the crosshairs. That recording was not only an act of revelation, but a call for silent resistance. It reaffirmed to me that the case had transcended the professional to become a duel between a corrupt system and the fight to cleanse those rotten roots with truth as the only weapon. The investigation was no longer abstract. It was personal, a battle that defined not just a file, but lives and destinies. Amid so much pressure, we never lost sight of the purpose. We knew patience was key, and that every small step, no matter how insignificant it seemed, was vital to staying firm. We relied on the conviction that justice is not served on a silver platter, but is built through daily work, courage, and sacrifice. The gleam of that upside-down pen, the invisible object that no one wanted to see, continued to be a beacon in the dark, a constant reminder that truth was hidden in the details, in what others discard or ignore. Finally, the revelation about the innocent company showed us the sophistication of a network. Discovering that this clean and respected facade was actually the core that pulled strings and protected those involved indicated that the enemy was much smarter and more calculating than we had thought. Corruption took complex forms and evolved to avoid detection, using the same technology we employed against them to maintain their power. It was as if we were playing a game of mirrors, where every attempt to approach the truth made you lose balance and face a darker reflection. During those intense weeks, I understood that forensic work was much more than science or technique. It was an immense social responsibility, a commitment to those who will have no voice and to the history written behind every case. My work became a profound struggle between the visible and invisible, between what is written in reports and what hides in the shadows of power. The path was difficult and not free of sacrifices, but the feeling of advancing toward justice was worth every effort, every sleepless night, every fear faced. Now, looking back, I know that man with his out-of-place pen and that barely perceptible stain on an everyday object symbolized the very essence of my work. Because sometimes the greatest stories are born from the smallest things, and justice is only achieved when you have the strength to look at what no one wants to see, to seek what everyone prefers to ignore. And although the end of the story is yet to be written, I know that as long as there are eyes willing to see and hands determined to act, the truth will always find a way to come to light, as faint, bright, and persistent as a small, upside-down pen on the ground. As we progress, the pieces were falling into place. But what we uncovered was never simple or comfortable. The web of deceit, secret pacts, and double lives of many people connected to the case began to come to light with a breathtaking cruelty. It wasn't just physical evidence or documents. All of this also leaked into behavior, into the doubts that arose before our very eyes, and into the silent betrayal lurking in the least expected corners. It was then that I realized we weren't facing just a crime, but a structure that seemed to feed off fear and complicity, a machine fueled by silence and oblivion. Every time we seemed to approach a key point, a shadow would cover that light and force us to backtrack, rethink strategies, and rebuild that network of information to move forward once again. The days turned into an exhausting cycle where anxiety and uncertainty were constant companions. On one occasion, I clearly remember how a clue that seemed insignificant led us to an unexpected contact. A silent informant who seemed to be on the edge of the abyss sent us a package with altered documents, handwritten notes, and clippings that proved that the power elites not only knew about the case, but were making decisions to divert attention and manipulate testimonies. It was disconcerting and even frightening to see how far corruption could go to protect its impunity. That revelation reminded me that every little detail, no matter how small, could be a link to break that chain. The pen, the stain, the homemade recording, everything made sense when viewed without prejudice or haste. But as the investigation deepened, the effect on the team also intensified. The tension was not only external but internal. The pressure began to erode trust. We faced ethical and personal dilemmas that no one had prepared us to confront. There were nights when arguments became heated, where frustration wreaked havoc on morale, and where even silence became a silent enemy devouring hope. I learned in those moments that the real challenge was not discovering the truth, but holding on to it despite the forces trying to destroy it. We couldn't give up, that was clear, but there was a very high price to pay. An unexpected event marked one of the most critical points. One day, we received an anonymous message warning us of an alleged operation to destabilize the investigation from within. We suspected someone was leaking information, but we didn't know who or what the consequences would be. That's why we decided to implement a series of countermeasures. Meetings only with the most trusted, reinforced security devices, and strict control over access to sensitive data. That paranoid atmosphere, although necessary, grew like a snowball in our spirits. However, something kept me firm. The commitment that the truth, no matter how hidden, had to come out, even if that meant crossing limits we thought were insurmountable. And then there was a twist that was more disconcerting than any other up to that point. During a thorough review of evidence, we came across a file that was not in the registry, a case that at first seemed unrelated but had direct connections to the network we were dismantling. The coincidence was unsettling. Same names, similar dates, patterns of manipulation, and cover-ups that repeated with almost obsessive precision. That dual circulation of information and deceit showed us how deep the tangled web was and how high the stakes were. It wasn't just an isolated case. It was the tip of a criminal iceberg that could sink many, but that also had the power to open a breach of hope in the system. For the first time, I felt we were around the corner from something definitive, even though the path was still a minefield. The nights became long vigils, with exhaustion barely allowing us to stay conscious. Yet in those moments of fatigue, it was the thought of that little pen that served as an anchor. I remembered how something so simple and seemingly insignificant had been the starting point for so much transformation, for a fight that had gone beyond a purely forensic realm. If that almost invisible stain could change the course of an investigation, then no detail should be dismissed. Patience was not just a virtue. It was the only viable strategy against an enemy moving surrounded by layers of lies. Another dawn. While reviewing the videos and audios again, I found something we hadn't noticed before. In the background of the scene, almost hidden behind a curtain, a figure appeared briefly that didn't seem to fit, a presence we hadn't associated with the network. That unexpected revelation triggered a new phase in the investigation, because it meant that some pieces, the most dangerous ones, moved with extreme caution, seeking to remain invisible. That silent search made me understand a harsh truth. Corruption is not only protected by power and money, but with shadow, invisibility, the absence of witnesses who can directly point fingers. That's why forensic work, that laborious scrutiny of detail, was more important than ever. Discovering what no one sees was not a luxury. It was a necessity to break those defenses. The threats, although subtle, became increasingly palpable. It wasn't irrational fear, but the real weight of knowing someone watched every action, that the border between safety and danger could blur in the blink of an eye. That's why the group's strength was crucial, as was a trust in those dedicating their lives to justice. We became not just a work team, but a bastion against fear, a community that understood our fight was not just for that file or that evidence, but for the memory, for the dignity of those who could no longer speak. I learned that commitment is not carried in a briefcase, but on the skin, and that, despite everything, there were things worth defending with every fiber of the soul. In the end, just when it seemed the forces were breaking us, when the weight of darkness pushed us to surrender, clarity appeared. One night, I received a message with coordinates for a meeting that changed everything again. The information shared that night was so crucial that it reshaped the investigation's lines and allowed us to identify the true masterminds behind an operation that seemed unbeatable. That revelation was like opening a window to the sun after an endless storm. But at the same time, I also knew that was only the beginning of a much bigger battle. I had achieved the hardest part, to see the invisible, to name the unnameable, but the war to clean up that web was just starting. I will never forget the feeling of understanding that justice is a patient and delicate task, almost an art, where the small can have tremendous power. The inverted pen, the hidden stain, and all those scattered details were not just objects or marks. They were symbols of resistance, of the unyielding will of those who believe truth is a flame that can never go out. It is not a path for everyone. It is for those who, regardless of fear or shadow, are willing to look beyond, to find what others prefer to leave in darkness. Because it is in that act where true power resides, the power that transforms reality and opens new possibilities for a fairer world. Today I can say, without fear of being wrong, that this case changed me forever, not only professionally, but as a human being. Because in it, I learned that justice is not a state, but a constant process, a path where every step, no matter how small, can make a profound difference. And although there are still many battles to fight, I know that as long as there are watchful eyes and steady hands, no out-of-place pen will be just a forgotten object, but the living evidence that truth will always find its way out, as faint, persistent, and unstoppable as the light that slips through the darkest darkness.